My name is Kayla, and I am one of the student board members of the Parenting and Family Special Interest Group of ABCT. And we are so delighted to have you all here today for this amazing webinar, Parenting in the Age of Social Media Influencers. Our speaker today is Dr. Maya Barnett, who's an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Counseling, Clinical, and School Psychology, and a bilingual licensed psychologist. She runs the Promoting Access Through Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and on Evidence-Based Services Lab, or the PAJES Lab, of which I am so grateful to be a part of. And she's also the director of the Parent-Child Interaction Therapy Clinic at UCSB. Dr. Barnett is a certified regional trainer through PCIT International, and her research is focused on community partnered research projects that want to understand how to improve the access of evidence-based parenting interventions, such as PCIT for historically marginalized families. She has a specific interest in how parent-child relationships can be supported to promote resiliency in the face of adversity. And she's had research and training support through the National Institute of Mental Health. So we are so excited to have Dr. Barnett here to talk to us about this topic, which I know a lot of people have questions and thoughts about. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Barnett.
Thanks so much, Kayla, and thank you all for attending. I'm excited to see some names that I recognize in the audience, and also excited to see a lot of names that I don't recognize in the audience. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, or if you ask questions and you want to say when you do, if you are a parent or a therapist or both, or a parenting influencer, it would be great to hear from you. So today I'm going to be talking about this new brave new world we're in, where we are parenting in the age of social media influencers, or possibly working with parents that are being impacted by social media influencers. So I just want to start with giving a little overview of what this talk is going to be about. I got questions that people submitted, and if you hear what this talk is going to be about and then you think, I did not want to attend this talk, I wanted to attend a talk that was more related to my questions, I will not be offended if you leave the talk. So I'm going to be talking today about social media influencers who focus on parenting specifically, and things that they say about different evidence-based parenting practices, primarily in the area of early childhood mental health, so the use of praise, ignoring, and timeout. This is not going to be a talk focused on how social media is impacting children or teens themselves. So that's a great talk that definitely warrants a lot of attention, but I just want to be really clear about what I am talking about. And we're going to talk a little bit throughout it on these different practices, what is being said, where our concerns might be about that based on where the evidence base is, and then also some recommendations that I have about how to recognize when an influencer might have some red flags around them, or also some green flags, things that we might like. So I got a lovely introduction from Kayla, but I want to talk a little bit more about who I am and why I have really come to care quite a lot about this question of social media influencers. So I have been working in the space of helping children with mental health challenges, honestly, even before I graduated from college, but immediately post-graduating from college, I worked with a very vulnerable population of young children who mostly had extensive trauma histories. They were involved in the foster care system. They had parents who had substantiated types of abuse, physical abuse, neglect of them, often related to substance use. And this really drove my passion for trying to understand how to best help these kids, but also help all parents. And I entered into graduate school in the early 2000s and was working in a rural location. And I was really focused on what I think many people who enter into this field feel at the beginning, which is helping parents who might have a harsher parenting style really learn how to enhance their attachment with kids and set limits in a safe um, and healthy way. And I bring this up because even now, when I'm training clinicians, often I think that these are the parents that we have in mind when we think about teaching different strategies. Um, and what I have found as time has passed is that often parents that are coming into my clinic now are coming in with different concerns, and in fact, are much more concerned that they are inflicting trauma upon their children using what we would consider to be safe and healthy parenting strategies. And that's got me really thinking about what is going on, and where is all this anxiety coming from for parents. And I also experienced this quite a bit in my personal life. I noticed, a while ago now, I don't need to put years on it, that all of a sudden I was getting these phone calls or these texts kind of not late at night, but early evening to late evening from friends of mine that had decided to start trying sleep training with their babies. And the texts or calls basically were, I've decided I want to do this. I feel like I'm at the end of my rope. I need sleep desperately, but as I'm doing this, I'm also scrolling online and I'm reading all of this thing about how much I'm hurting. Please tell me that I'm not ruining my child's attachment to me, or I am not. Is this the equivalent of my child being in a Romanian orphanage? And I figured that people were probably calling me because they knew that I was going to say, look at your wonderful life that you provide. Look how much you love your baby. Look at what all of the time looks like. Of course, this isn't the equivalent of being an orphanage. Um, and this just continued as my friends were dealing with potty training, with these calls just coming in, and also within the clinic, parents coming in and saying, I feel like I am inflicting trauma upon my child using conducting doing potty training, doing sleep training, putting my kid in timeout. And I see parents feeling ashamed, ridden with guilt, and stressed by things that they're reading. And so I think this is really important for us to address and think about how to talk about. So what is going on? As we know, all of us are carrying around these little tablets, these little phones that are filled with different forms of social media that some of us might follow different types of accounts, but no matter what algorithms are figuring out, if people are parenting, if they have questions, if they're maybe Googling, like, what do I do when my child's having a tantrum, and are being fed a lot of information. And this really escalated during the pandemic when parents had a lot more stress and a lot more questions because they were often at home 24/7 with their kids, having to manage behaviors, academics, and other concerns, and with a lot of time looking for those questions and a lot of isolation. And so the people who became the closest supports in their life were often coming through social media. And a lot of the parenting influencers really took off, started having millions of followers during this time. And I just want to pause for a moment and point out that not only was this time sort of making sense, but I think that this deep fear of what do I have to do so that my child isn't harmed makes sense in the context of a society where so much stress and adversity is happening. You're seeing a world in which lots of things are outside of parents' control, and they're looking for areas that they can control, which is their own parenting practice. So these parenting practices have gotten a lot of media buzz. Um, there's a lot of words for these types of parenting practices. Most commonly, you hear gentle parenting, respectful parenting, Montessori parenting, lots and lots of different terms. I would say that the using and confusing of terms is a big part of what happens with these influencers. So I'm not going to get into that too much. But I think that the first thing I want to focus on is what is good, what draws us in with parenting influencers, and what we might like about it and learn from them. So these influencers really provide easily, oh, I meant to say accessible, but also acceptable and widely disseminated parenting recommendations. And they focus on many strategies and principles that actually do overlap with evidence-based programs. So a lot of these strategies talk about developing a warm relationship with children, focus on allowing kids to express their feelings using emotion coaching, and different emotion regulation strategies. And there is an emphasis, if you really look at the content of many of the um, people in the sphere, on the idea that you should balance warmth with boundaries. And I'm going to get into why I think the boundaries can be a little bit more challenging, which is basically that all of the accounts that I have followed have been very clear that parents should be setting limits, and it's okay to set limits. The strategies on how to do that and are often feel a little less developed, in my opinion. So I think that's the really good thing about parenting influencers. And good in the sense of we want parenting information out there, and good in like I like that content. I think it's good content. The bad part, in my opinion, is that the amount of things that parents are being told that they should not do is quite extensive and quite black and white thinking, in the sense of everything is being described as harmful, possibly traumatizing, or having negative impacts with very limited nuance. So I just put up a few examples of this. We hear about this with timeout. We hear about this with ignoring. We hear about this with the words "good job," with the idea that you would rush your children, um, that you shouldn't tell children that they need to share, or apologize. And well, I would say that some of these posts might have a grain of something to consider in them. Um, they're quite shocking to parents. They can be pretty stressful. And I think one thing to really consider about it is the words that are being used, and what does it actually mean to inflict harm or trauma, and also what does it mean to say that about kind of common things that happen within parenting. They're not talking about how you can use something in a more effective way, or why doing it something might be like not quite what we would want, but the framing is often that this is harmful, and that's my concern. And specifically, I have a lot of concern about this, like I said, because of the amount of stress and pressure that I see parents being under. The previous Surgeon General actually um, put out a report on parent mental health and stress as a national concern, um, talking about how many parents, almost 50% of parents in the United States, saying that they are feeling extreme levels of overwhelm and stress on a daily basis. And this report outlines a number of reasons why this is happening. I want to give credit to all of those. You know, there's a lot of financial stress and economic instability, and obviously parents living in poverty are experiencing high levels of stress. As I said before, we're living through stressful times and have been for a while. So just the COVID pandemic, questions about health and safety, school shootings, there's a lot of things that have parents feeling out of control of how they can protect their children's health and safety. And so looking for areas that they can. The time demands of parenting are quite high right now. Intensive parenting is really the mode, which is the idea that parents are spending a lot more time with their kids than they have historically. There's a lot of scheduling, there's a lot of pressure around achievement for children, especially with the economic instability right now, that people really feel like their kid has to have the absolute highest level of accomplishment to be successful in the world. And parents are feeling isolated and lonely. And that is something that has related to the lockdowns and COVID, but also existed prior to that. So social media is a huge area of stress. And as I said at the beginning, some of that social media stress does come from what they should do about what their kids are doing on social media. But a lot of social media stress also comes from what parents are seeing on social media, the way that they're comparing themselves to other, and the rampant misinformation that is being spread around a lot of things, including parenting. And the other concerns I have about this is around children's mental health, which is also an area of crisis in our country. The parenting advice is being messaged as one size fits all in these accounts, or a lot of them actually do say like this is even better for kids who might be having more difficult behaviors, where we're actually seeing that the strategies are quite limited, especially for kids who might struggle more with different clinical diagnoses. And they are often speaking against a robust evidence base of behavioral strategies that have been shown to improve mental health outcomes. So not only improving behaviors, which I'll talk about more, but also actually improving children's rates of depression and anxiety and trauma symptoms. So the goals for today is I want to talk about the evidence base for 3 common parenting strategies that are really getting a lot of negative attention from social media influencers, and learn some strategies for you as a parent or you as a therapist to reconcile what the evidence and the influencers say. And just so that parents can have a full toolbox, because like I said, they might be providing some tools that are quite helpful, but they are also quite focused on taking away a lot of tools that have been shown from decades and decades of work and research to help families. So the first one I want to talk about is praise. We're starting with the thing that is maybe the most surprising, I would say, that it's being criticized. And that is the concern with praise basically can be summed up in the idea that praise can lower intrinsic motivation and it makes children dependent on the views of others. So if a parent comes into my clinic and we're talking about praise and they say, I don't want my child to become a people pleaser or codependent, I sort of go like, oh, I think that this is a parent that probably has been following some of these parenting influencers. And I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind as I'm talking to them about absolutely every single strategy. So there is some important research to know about these concerns. One, praise has been associated actually with increased intrinsic motivation, along with improved social and academic skills. And as many people who work with parents know, there are ways to praise kids that are more effective than others. And one thing I really like to focus on when parents have these concerns is getting into why some praise might be more helpful than other praise. I don't focus too much on the exact statements of social media influencers. I spend as little time as possible being on the defensive and saying, that's not true, and more just informing parents on what we do know about praise and what can help. So we know that when we praise the process and not the person, there's better evidence that it can lead to positive outcomes. So saying things like, I'm proud about how you stuck with it, opposed to, you are so smart. I'll just quickly say it. This is actually interesting to me because one of the more popular social media influencers who's very anti-praise does a lot of specific praise of the child. Will say, you're a good kid, you're just having a hard time, and then says like all this stuff about why you shouldn't do praise. And so I'm always so confused about why we're only saying a child's good when they're having a hard time, but also why we're using such trait-based praises, which we know from the research aren't effective, and not allowing process-based praises, which are really effective. We also know that praises are more effective when they're specific. So it's going to be more helpful to tell a child, good job cleaning up, versus good job. And that praise shouldn't be coercive. So just saying, I love how you shared after a child did share, opposed to the, I sure would love it if you shared. So there are ways to bring nuance to this conversation. And there are definitely ways that we know, again, from lots and lots of years of practice and research, on how to make praises really more effective. But the evidence just is not there around the concerns that are being brought up with change praise. So I brought some concerns that I hear often. I don't want my child to need praise for everything. And we like to talk to parents about how you don't need to praise children for everything that they do, but really focusing on the behaviors that are important to you and hard for the kid. So I'm going to pause on both of those and talk about why I think that's a critical conversation to have with parents. The important to you is that often parents who even have concerns about these praises because of things that they've seen really do feel that they have certain values within their families that are things that they would like to focus on. And then the heart for the child really addresses this issue of intrinsic motivation. It can be helpful to talk to parents about how there's a lot of things that you need some reward for, or you might reward yourself for, either by getting a paycheck or maybe a little treat at the end of the day, because it's just not something that you have intrinsic motivation for. So maybe we don't need to be praising our kids for their most favorite activity, but we do need to be praising them for things that are quite hard. And lots of things are hard for kids, including sharing, including staying calm, including sitting at the table, and those are things that we might want to focus our praise on. And then the other concern around being a people pleaser or codependent is that the praise always has to be external for kids. And so you can also work with parents on, one, making sure that they really are quite genuine in their praises, so that kids so they're not feeling like they're just only giving their kids praise for something that they don't believe in, but also modeling self-praise, that if they want their child to have kind of this like robust self-esteem and this ability to trust themselves and praise themselves, that the parents themselves can be providing that praise for themselves. And many of us who have been doing this work, maybe providing parent-child interaction therapy or another parenting practice, have certainly seen kids who start to praise their parents when they've been getting a lot of praise, or say things like, I did such a good job building this tower, so I don't have concerns that this is something that happens, but it's a thing that you can talk about with parents on how to help them feel more assured that their child is going to learn to internalize their voices and not necessarily only need to seek praise from others. Okay, I'll just pause there for a second. Anybody have a specific thing on praise? Ignoring is another strategy that we hear and see a lot on, of how ignoring is really like abandoning a child when they need parents most, and a form of rejection of children. And one thing I will just say and keep reiterating again and again and again is, a lot of the language and the research that has been done has now been warped and misused within social media. So one, we can work to reclaim terms and be like, that's not what ignoring means. The other thing I highly encourage is maybe just using a different term too. So already we say things like differential reinforcement and selective attention. I find those a little clinical and maybe not the most approachable things to say, but really working with parents to understand that good ignoring and good selective attention means that some minor misbehaviors are ignored, while other behaviors and in general children and their needs are getting attention. It is important to really center yourself and then help the parents center themselves in this idea that children that are hurt are not ignored. Kids that are very tired, for example, can still be comforted. We are not rejecting kids just because they're experiencing feelings. We are maybe using strategies to help redirect in a neutral and calm way. And so a lot of, again, you might hear parenting influencers talking about, staying calm, staying neutral, doing different things. And you're saying in your head, well, that's just ignoring what you blasted in your last post. And so helping yourself reconcile and then parents reconcile what ignoring might look like, and maybe saying like, oh, we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on this right now. Different language that might help parents that are feeling apprehensive about that word, ignore. All right. The last strategy that I'm really going to get into is probably the biggest one. And this has been a controversy now for a while. I would say even before the social media influencers, but they've latched on, which is on timeout. The concern is that this is isolating of children when they need you most, and that it is harmful. So the evidence base for timeout is extremely robust, actually. Though I don't find that that is always the best place to start with parents, but I do like to be very clear about where the evidence base is. So one is that there is a lot we know from practice, we know from research that timeout improves behaviors like improved listening, not having as much non-compliance, that is, and improvements in aggression. What I have found working with parents that are really quite concerned about timeout is that that focus on behaviors is not necessarily where their concerns are coming from. And so it really is quite important to talk about how timeout also can help with emotion regulation. Um, so retrospective research has shown us that standard use of timeout, the way that parents just implement timeout on their own, is not at all associated with negative mental health outcomes. And so that's really encouraging because the type of timeout that social media influencers are often acting out or talking about is not the way that we would teach timeout in a parenting program, which I'll get into what that looks like, but is more of the like, go to your room. You're like, stop screaming and go to your room. And even that timeout, which is not as effective as what is taught in programs, has not been associated with negative mental health outcomes. Um, and in fact, what we find is beyond helping behaviors, that programs that use the balance of relationship building and effective timeouts actually have not just improvements in behaviors, but also anxiety and depression and other emotional concerns, including improved emotion regulation and improved attachment. So the biggest concerns that are coming out about this is, fine, I might train my child to be a robot, is what I hear, but they're going to be so emotionally defeated and they're not going to feel like I'm there for them. But what we know from the research and what we see in practice is actually that kids can really gain confidence in themselves because they have learned that they can tolerate disappointment, they can tolerate having to listen to their parents' limits, and that they feel safer with their parents because their parents can give and hold those limits. Um, so this is critical to sort of where that information has been misconstrued and is important to talk about with parents when they are concerned that this is not attending to the emotional component of what is happening with their kids. All right, thank you. I'm just going to take a big drink of water. So what I just want to take just a second for those of you who maybe aren't practitioners to talk about what is part of an evidence-based timeout. I see the chat blowing up with this information, so that's fantastic. But just a reminder that effective timeouts are used within a warm relationship, and all evidence-based parenting programs first focus on that relationship enhancement. And without that, it is less effective. We don't want to have that be the only tool in the toolbox. Again, the point of this conversation and the point that we as practitioners who are helping parents is to give a complete full toolbox, not to say any one thing is going to be the problem solver. An effective timeout is predictable and fair. So the directions the parents give are very clear. We work on how to give them clearly, and they always have a consistent warning, and the follow through is always consistent. So kids learn that they will always follow through with it. Timeouts are relatively short, so it's not sending your kids to the room for hours. It's a few minutes. And the parent is in charge of ending the timeout. And then I always like to talk about there is an opportunity to learn at the end of timeout, which is that kids are ending timeout when they're ready to follow through on their original direction. So if the direction was about cleaning up the toys, they don't go to timeout and have the parents clean up, and then they sort of go off and are mad, and the parents are mad, clean up the toys. No, they're calm, everybody's calming down, and then the kid is coming back and doing the cleanup. And I really want to point out this opportunity to learn, because a very common thing that I see again and again and again on social media is timeout is a form of punishment that is lumped in with punitive spanking and other forms of physical aggression, which actually many of us who've been doing this for a long time know that timeout was really developed to replace those behaviors. And they'll say the word discipline. Discipline means to learn, to be a disciple, and those ones don't teach. Only kind of having conversations with your kids is teaching. And in fact, this learning through behavior, through practice is very developmentally appropriate for young kids, and it is a learning opportunity, and that is what kids learn, and they learn a lot of things in timeout. They learn that they are capable of keeping themselves, calming themselves down. They learn that they are able to tolerate different directions that they hear from their parents, and they do learn to follow through at the end of it. And that's what makes timeout most effective. So I just went over that concern that timeout does not teach children skills, and actually it really does teach children that they can listen and they can be safe and that they can calm down. And then the other concern we hear a lot is timeout is isolating my child when they emotionally need me. And the way that timeout is portrayed the most on social media is the idea that you would send a child to timeout when they're very emotionally dysregulated. And I always like to remind myself, I like to remind the therapist I'm training, and then I like to remind the parents that I'm working with that we're not actually sending kids to timeout really ever if it's because they got hurt or sad or but even that emotion dysregulation is not the time that we're often going to have a child go to timeout. We're usually waiting for moments of calm opportunities to initiate, like, please put on your shoes or please clean up these toys. Kids might become dysregulated after that, but that's a whole other thing. And in fact, is consistent with what we hear from social media influencers, which they often say, like, you can set a boundary and stick with it, and your child can have any emotional response to that, and you can stay calm in it. We are just with timeout providing the tool that you can do to follow through in that moment, opposed to just saying, have a boundary and stick with it, which can be quite hard to do without a follow-up plan. So just a quick pause there. Anybody has any questions? And then I'm going to get into some strategies I have for identifying parenting influencers. All right. So I have a few red flags and green flags that I've identified in following parenting influencers. And I was hoping to I had a little bit of a thought that I was going to provide a whole list of people that I think are great to follow. I decided not to do that. I have one person that is an example that I'll talk about at the end. But I decided not to, one, because I was concerned about a full vetting, and also because sometimes I feel like things can shift in people's content, and I didn't want to recommend somebody who maybe might come and change their approach later on. So green flags, there's helpful advice without immediately being told to buy a course. The tone really focuses on things like what is right for your family. So influencers that I have found that I like a lot might talk about something like timeout, and they'll say, this is what the evidence is, if this feels right for your family. And I think that's a nice approach for people, especially who are not direct providers working with an extended period of time with families. There is minimal focus on what parents are doing wrong and more focus on what can help parents with a variety of different behaviors. And they include their research sources, though, as I somewhat alluded to, it has been put in the chat, even the way research studies are presented can be misconstrued, so it's not always the right thing. Red flags, I have simple advice, and if it doesn't work, buy the course. The focus is on very precise scripts that you're supposed to use, without this sort of overarching tone of like, this might work or you might need to try something different. It's like, this is going to solve things for your kid. Common parenting practices that have a robust evidence base, like I said, are being told to cause harm or trauma. And you as a parent might feel guilty, stressed, or confused by the advice that you're getting. The other thing that I would say I've noticed a lot in some of my red flag accounts is that they actually have quite a lot about what you should do as a parent after you lose it and start maybe yelling at your kid. And well, we want to always diminish the shame and guilt that parents could have if they do snap at their kids. There is part of me that always wonders why the focus is so much on that and the repair and not giving tools so that parents aren't getting pushed, because what we know is that the evidence shows that a lot of times permissive parents or parents that don't have effective strategies to use in discipline are more likely to have this inconsistency where they are really quite calm and then they'll use a harsh technique because they don't have another strategy. So I think that that's important to keep in consideration. All right, some recommendations for parents. First of all, figure out what works for you, your child, family, and values. I think that there are probably some parenting influencers that are quite unhelpful for parents that are coming into my clinic, and the parents are feeling a lot of stress because they're being told not to use strategies that are consistent with PCAT. But there are kids and families that it might work for completely. So I don't want to just flip and say everything that they say is wrong and everything I say is right, because I don't feel like that dialogue is good. We're all looking for nuance here. There are some evidence-based influencers that you could find. The parenting translator, very specifically, is somebody who really works to talk about the evidence of every different research study and does both brief posts but more in-depth articles about it, and has done really nice ones on all of the topics that I just talked about. And then my hot take is just unfollow those influencers that are no longer helping you, maybe even if they have helped you in the past. All right, some recommendations for therapists. Open this conversation and talk to parents about what they are seeing and hearing just directly. Like, I'm wondering if you're following anybody on social media, or like what advice you're liking from that, or having any questions or concerns about it. It's helpful to learn the lingo, both, like I said, so that if you hear a parent saying something like, I'm afraid if I praise my child that they're going to become codependent, I'm like, oh, I've heard a lot of influencers say that. So I'm going to know that might be something happening. And also, we need to get comfortable with changing our own lingo. If the word timeout is so upsetting to parents because the way that it's been portrayed, I've changed that and talked about it as like taking a pause, taking a break. And so really checking with parents about what concerns they might have and being like, well, this is quite different than that. Can we call it something else? I wish that I had this in me, but I do not. But I hope that some of the people in this audience do, and I actually know that some of you do. Become the influencer. We are maybe not getting as much of the evidence base strategies out there in a fun and appealing way. And so our voices need to be more widely disseminated as well. And I put the same advice that I put for parents to therapists, which is basically from my own life, which is I spent a few months following a bunch of these influencers to get more on the ground with this, and then eventually it was making me quite unhappy, and so I unfollowed them all, and I've been feeling better ever since. So you can also unfollow the influencers that are no longer helping you. And with that, I just want to thank everyone in the audience and open it up to questions. And I'll scroll through the chat, but also if you have them, please feel free to pop onto camera and pop off of mute and say it. I've seen a great question just to get us started with from Mariana about how PCAT itself uses scripts, especially in the around timeout. Might some parents view that as a red flag? I think that's great to differentiate with. Yes, all things have this like, well, and I've thought about that too. PCAT also tells parents, don't ask questions, commands, and criticisms. And so one of the things I think about is really having explanations around all of that. Even the don't behaviors we talk about, sort of like only having that within special time, why we're focusing on there's a rationale for that, and there's space in the rest of your day-to-day life to use it. I think the script of the timeout procedure is also just helping with predictability. So it's a very specific situation that you are helping parents understand how this increases predictability. The scripts that I'm seeing on Instagram are more like, if your child says, I don't want to go to the store with you, here's what you say, which is harder to generalize or use always those same words again and again and again. Let's see.
I have a question, if I can just
Yeah.
shout it out. I'm
Hi.
Hi, I'm a fellow PCIT therapist. I wonder, what are your thoughts on what the general messaging should be about timeout? Because, we use it in this in PCIT, we use it in such a structured way. And like you said, after we have that, relationship building phase. And it's hard to consider giving that advice to the general public or others who are interested in learning more about timeout, but not within the context of PCIT or, within the context of treatment. So I'm curious what you think the proper way to guide others in terms of timeout. What do you think that should look like?
Honestly, I think this is such a good question. And I'm gonna be honest, I really actually think that our very like careful, researched backed way of thinking things is probably what keeps a lot of us off of social media, like being social media influencers. And we're so like we're not ready to teach you this important skill yet. I won't even talk about it until you're fully ready for it. And then I think that's actually not really helping us spread the word on what is good. So I think one, not keeping time out like this big secret that nobody's allowed to even hear about how to do it effective. Like you're just not even allowed to hear about an effective timeout until you can do it in PCAT. I don't think it's doing us favors. Like I think that there's ways to reclaim the narrative and say like the most important, it's extremely important that kids have a warm relationship with parents. Um, and that's the foundation. And also, it's important that kids have limits, and timeout is a tool that can be used. And here's what the way I did, here's what makes timeout effective is when it can be learned for learning, it can be a place to calm down. I think increasing the way that we're talking about that actually would be more helpful than sort of being, really holding back on providing any information whatsoever. And honestly, going to the literature even that has showed that retrospectively, like an improperly implemented timeout is not necessarily going to be causing a lot of harm, and just a few strategies on how it might work. Now, obviously, ideally, if you're working with families, you are still going through it very precisely. But I think that thinking about how we could better disseminate that information is probably important and something that we've shied away from.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really, yeah, an interesting challenge, but yes, thank you. That's really helpful.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of us know that it's actually not that easy of a technique to use. Now, a lot of us are working with the kiddos that are the absolute hardest to use it with. And that's not all kiddos, but just recognizing. And so I also just always talk about it, like if I'm talking about it with friends, I will just say, like, just so you know, it's not as harmful. Like you're still fine. Like, and I'll reinforce, I'll say, like, and you have a really warm relationship with your kids. So I'm confident that this is not going to like provide harm.
Thank you.
Any other, sorry, put your questions again if I'm liking the conversation, but I maybe have missed. Yes, Alyssa, I sort of, you asked what parenting influencer should be on your radar. I agree with Ryan that the tough thing is that there's a real mixture of sound and sketchy advice. And I actually have found, like I said, I followed some and then I just had to unfollow them. But then sometimes I'll like pop in and see what's going on in there. And I actually think that one of the things that's most concerning is I'm seeing kind of even an uptick of like it gets sketchier over time. Like they start stronger, then it gets like a little bit. And I think I have a few thoughts about this. One of it though is that the job of being on social media is kind of constantly having content that's getting viewed, and so having hotter and hotter takes is helping drive more traffic. And also they maybe are going to start being with different brands, like being sponsored by other things that are more pseudoscientific. And so that just is something to watch out for. It also, I've seen a lot of it becoming like a game of telephone. And so you'll hear, and I think good job to me is like one of these examples. So, in PCAT, we often talk about like, don't just say good job to your kids, say good job for, and why it's not specific enough. And then people start talking about like, and then the most recent thing I read or saw was somebody said, you can't say good job to a kid because it causes them to become stressed and confused because children don't have jobs. And I was like, that is so out there at this point. And the idea of like a hurried child syndrome, if we've heard about that, that was really introduced by somebody who was talking about how you shouldn't be pushing kids to do things that are beyond their developmental level, like doing academics that are above where they are developmentally, which again, I think I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like something I would talk about with families. But now it's almost like somebody sees it as a 90-second clip and then they make their own 90-second clip of it. So now the idea is if you hurry a child, like put on your shoes and give them a short period of time to do that, that is going to cause anxiety and stress long term in them. So I think that that's another reason why it's hard to identify people who kind of are going to stay consistently recommendable. But we should have more. We should have more of them. All right, we're almost at time. I really enjoyed having this conversation with everybody. I hope we can have more of them. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'll put my email in the chat. And that's great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. Yeah, this was so helpful and had so much good info. I'm just thinking about so many of the clients and families that come through um, our clinic and the various places that I've been, and just kind of ways to talk about this, and just recognizing how nimble and kind of flexible we have to be as therapists in communicating based on the information that parents have already received. So it's really nice to be thinking about like where are the different sources of information coming from. Yeah, we will have a couple more webinars coming up this year from the ABCT Parenting and Family SIG. And so we hope that you'll join us for the next one in a few months' time. And we hope you have a good rest of your day. So thank you.